Judge mocks Clint Eastwood in court, only to be left speechless by his brilliant legal skills. Before we jump into this jaw-dropping courtroom showdown, make sure to smash that subscribe button and let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Now, let's dive right into the action. The Monterey County courtroom was packed, every seat taken, every inch of standing room filled with eager spectators. The air buzzed with murmurs and hushed speculation. This wasn't just another lawsuit. It was Clint Eastwood, the legendary Hollywood icon, standing at the plaintiff's table. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Some nudged their neighbors in excitement, while others discreetly lifted their phones, hoping to capture this moment on camera. Outside, news vans lined the streets, satellite dishes raised high, all waiting to broadcast the drama as it unfolded. For over 6 decades, Clint Eastwood had stared down outlaws, corrupt sheriffs, and ruthless villains on the big screen. But today, his opponent wasn't some gunslinger in a dusty saloon. It was something far more formidable, the legal system itself. At the heart of the case, a simple yet infuriating property dispute. A real estate developer, Gerald Mattson, had overstepped his boundaries, literally. He had encroached on Eastwood's land in Carmel by the Sea, building part of a luxury condominium where it had no business being. At first, Eastwood took the civil approach, letters, phone calls, formal complaints, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. Mattson ignored them all, pressing forward with his project. Now, Eastwood was left with no choice but to fight back, and he was ready. When Judge Wallace Bridger finally entered, the room fell into a hushed anticipation. The portly, silver-haired judge, a man in his 60s with decades of courtroom experience, adjusted his glasses, sizing up the unexpected plaintiff before him. A slow smirk spread across his lips. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, tapping his gavel lightly. "I understand you've decided to represent yourself today." The courtroom collectively held its breath as Clint Eastwood, standing tall and unwavering despite his 94 years, simply nodded. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the judge. "That's right." A ripple of chuckles spread through the audience. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Was he serious? Others grinned, waiting for what they assumed would be an absolute disaster. Even Mattson, seated beside his high-powered attorney, couldn't help but let out a smug laugh. Judge Bridger leaned forward, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Eastwood, you do understand that a courtroom is not a movie set, don't you? There are rules, procedures. It's not as simple as delivering a dramatic monologue and riding off into the sunset." Laughter erupted throughout the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, some whispering to their colleagues, "This is gold." But Clint? He didn't even flinch. He let the laughter wash over him, waiting patiently for it to die down. Then, in that calm, measured, unmistakable voice, he finally spoke. "I know the rules, Your Honor. And I know the law." The judge raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? And where exactly did you study law, Mr. Eastwood?" The courtroom exploded into laughter again. Chuckles turned into outright cackles. To them, this was a spectacle, an old movie star playing lawyer for the day. But Eastwood remained unfazed. Slowly, he reached into his leather-bound case file and pulled out a neatly stacked collection of documents. He placed them on the table with purpose, his fingers tapping lightly on the top page. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every single property law that applies to this case," he stated firmly. "I've read the local zoning codes. I've examined the precedents. And I have all the evidence needed to prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that my land has been unlawfully encroached upon." The room fell silent. The smirks faded. The judge's expression hardened, realizing that Eastwood was not here for theatrics. He was here to win. Now, if this courtroom is about justice, let's get to it. A heavy tension settled over the crowd. For the first time, everyone understood they had miscalculated him. Judge Bridger, clearing his throat, shifted in his seat. His earlier mockery now felt weighty, almost inappropriate. He straightened his robe, glancing at Eastwood with a newfound respect. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Let's proceed." Eastwood sat down, his expression unreadable. But as the murmurs in the courtroom faded, as the trial officially began, there was one undeniable truth hanging in the air. This was no ordinary case. And Clint Eastwood? He was no ordinary man. Judge mocks Clint Eastwood until he's left stunned by his legal mastery. Before we dive into this incredible courtroom battle, take a second to hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into it. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs, sneers, and amused whispers, had transformed into something entirely different. A hush fell over the spectators as Judge Wallace Bridger adjusted his robe, casting a skeptical glance at Clint Eastwood, still standing tall and resolute. The judge, still half expecting an awkward, disorganized argument, sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed with your opening statement," he said, his tone laced with expectation, perhaps even amusement. Eastwood, moving at his own deliberate pace, placed both hands lightly on the table in front of him. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He let the silence settle, a technique mastered through decades of on-screen intensity. The weight of his presence alone commanded attention. No words were spoken, yet the entire courtroom leaned in, waiting. Finally, in a low, measured voice, he spoke. "In 1992, I purchased a stretch of land in Carmel by the Sea." His tone was calm but firm, his gaze locked onto the judge. The property lines were clearly recorded, the boundaries set in stone. "Over the years, I paid my taxes, maintained the land, and followed every local regulation to the letter." He reached into his case file, pulling out a meticulously arranged set of legal documents, and placed them neatly on the table. "But last year, Mr. Madsen and his company decided that my land no longer belonged to me." A flicker of curiosity passed over Judge Bridger's face, but Eastwood wasn't finished. With deliberate precision, he slid forward another thick stack of documents. "Madsen's company built on my land, without my consent. They ignored boundary lines, disregarded permits, and when I reached out to handle things civilly, they ignored me too." The room, once filled with laughter, was now dead silent. The reporters, the spectators, even Madsen's own legal team, sat in rapt attention. The arrogant smirks that had dotted the courtroom earlier? Gone. Eastwood continued, pulling out aerial photographs taken over the years. He spread them across the table, letting the evidence speak for itself. "These images," he said, tapping one with his weathered fingers, "show my land before construction began. And this," he slid another forward, "shows how Madsen's project crept into my property, bit by bit, inch by inch." A murmur ran through the crowd. Even Judge Bridger shifted in his chair, examining the photos with a newfound seriousness. Suddenly, Gerald Parker, Madsen's high-powered attorney, stood. A tall, sharp-featured man in a designer suit, he exuded the confidence of someone used to winning cases before they even started. "Your Honor, if I may," he began. But Eastwood didn't even glance at him. Instead, he simply lifted a hand, signaling without words that he was not finished speaking. The interruption was so unexpected, Parker hesitated, blinking, caught off guard. Judge Bridger, momentarily amused, tilted his head before nodding for Eastwood to continue. Without missing a beat, Clint reached into his stack again, this time producing printed email exchanges, legal notices, and formal requests that had all been sent to Madsen's company months before. "This is every attempt I made to resolve this issue before bringing it here," he said, his voice unwavering. Then, without breaking eye contact, he directed his next words right at Madsen himself. "You had every opportunity to do the right thing, and you chose not to." A heavy silence fell over the room. Parker, recovering from his earlier hesitation, forced a scoff, straightening his tie. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, regaining his composure, "Mr. Eastwood has certainly done his homework, and I commend the effort. But let's be realistic, he is not a lawyer. These legal matters are complicated. Yes, he's presenting evidence, but does he even understand the nuances of property law?" He turned, flashing a knowing smirk at the courtroom. The momentary tension lifted slightly, a few in the crowd chuckling once more. But Eastwood? He leaned forward, meeting Parker's confident gaze head-on. "I understand the law just fine," he said. "And more importantly, I understand when someone's breaking it." Parker chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think this is like one of your movies, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The lone man standing against the system? Taking on the big bad corporate villains." He turned to the judge with a practiced sigh. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally object to this entire charade. This courtroom deserves a proper trial, not a performance." All eyes turned to Judge Bridger. The air felt thick with tension. Bridger, still rubbing his temple, exhaled slowly before glancing over at Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have a response?" Clint nodded once.
"Yeah."
"You want a performance?" He gestured toward the cameras, the reporters, the entire courtroom. "Go watch one of my films. But this?" He motioned toward the evidence-laden table. "This is real. And I take real things seriously." The words hung in the air. Judge Bridger studied Eastwood for a long moment, then leaned forward, clasping his hands together. This was not what he had expected. When he first learned Clint Eastwood would be representing himself, he had been sure the case would be a spectacle, a washed-up movie star fumbling through legal jargon, making a fool of himself.
But now,
just minutes into the trial, that assumption was falling apart. The courtroom, which had been alive with laughter and murmurs, was now eerily still. The laughter had died, not just faded, but completely evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. An uncomfortable realization. Clint Eastwood wasn't here to play cowboy. He wasn't here to put on a show. He was here for justice. And, by the looks of it, he wasn't leaving without it. Judge Bridger, his mockery now forgotten, adjusted his robe and nodded. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said quietly. "You may proceed." Clint sat back in his chair, expression unreadable. But one thing was clear as day, they weren't laughing anymore.